Hola estudiantes, es tiempo para otro screencast lleno de acción. Muy bien, this time we're doing 6.3, capítulo 6, gramática 1, los verbos ser y estar. This is a pretty difficult thing for English speakers, so don't be discouraged if you don't get it right away. You'll notice that in the first two sections of vocab, we actually did a lot of work with this, and some of you caught on already, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth here with ser and estar. And the reason that this is difficult is because ser means to be, and estar means to be. So that's a little bit confusing. In English, we don't have two separate verbs for to be, but you're going to see that it's actually pretty specific when to use which one, and the way the book presents it is actually pretty easy to understand. They do a pretty good job with it, keeping it separate and keeping it nice and simple. If you try to Google this and get different explanations, there are entire chapters of grammar books that are dedicated to this. So I wouldn't recommend that because it can get pretty confusing. So now let's go to the book and see the pretty straightforward, simple explanation that they give us. Vamos! So here's what the book looks like. You can see that they separate it into características y condiciones. And that's a really simple way of trying to separate when to use which verb. So Spanish has two verbs that mean to be. They are ser and estar. These verbs have distinct uses. Ser expresses an inherent trait or characteristic that does not change. El edificio es muy alto. The building is very tall. And ella es sincera. She is sincere. Estar expresses a temporary state, emotion, or condition. Juan no está bien hoy, está enfermo. He's not doing well today, he's sick. That's temporary, right? That's a mood or a condition. La joven está cansada. The young girl is tired, right? Being tired, you're not always tired. That's a temporary state. Jose, ¿por qué estás nervioso? Why are you nervous? Being nervous is another temporary state. And then el agua está fría. The water is cold, right? Being cold. These are all temporary conditions, states, and sometimes emotions. And this is an important thing, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing, is you can often use either ser or estar, depending on what you mean to say. So you can use the same word with ser or estar and slightly change the meaning, or sometimes you can change it in a big way. For example, él es agresivo. He is naturally an aggressive type of person, right? He's an aggressive guy. Está muy agresivo. He's not normally that way, but now he's acting like he's kind of in an angry, aggressive mood. Ella es muy obstinada. She's a very obstinate type. She's a stubborn person. And then ella está muy obstinada. She's being very obstinate. Today she's in a really stubborn mood. So you can really change what you mean to say with just saying es or está, or soy or estoy. So you have to be careful with that. That's where it gets tough. But really, ser is for things that are permanent characteristics, and estar is for things that are kind of right now, temporary things. And you're going to see there's a couple exceptions when we get to actually talking about the notes. Okay, vamos. Entonces, let's start with ser. What we use ser for, pretty simple. We use it for personality, which we've talked about. For example, soy simpático. I'm a nice person. Of course I am. Permanent traits, like they gave you in the book. The building is tall. El edificio es alto. Right? Being tall is a permanent trait. And I know you can say, oh, well, what if you knock the building down and you build up a short one? Okay, well, you see what I'm saying. It's a permanent trait. It's a trait of the building that it's tall. It's not a mood or anything temporary. And then the third one that they don't explain to you that you should probably keep in mind, this is one of those exceptions, is time. It doesn't really make a lot of sense why we use a permanent thing for time. But when you say time, you always say es la or son las, right? So those are the forms of ser. So es la una is 1 o'clock. son las 8:05, it's 8:05. You always use ser for time. So I don't think that's too hard for anybody to understand. So let's move on to estar. With estar, we're using it for moods or emotions. For example, estás enfermo, you're sick. You are sick, right? Estás enfermo. Temporary conditions, like, for example, it's dry. You'd say, está seco, which we haven't learned that word, but there's an example. When something's dry, está seco, that's a temporary condition, right? Or the other one that we use estar for, that they don't explain, is for location. Again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because location for certain things, like a building, you can't really change that easily, but you still say está to say where something's located. So you say está aquí, for example. It's right here. Está aquí. So we use location. Or está detrás de, right? For example, behind. Está detrás de, right? So there's está, there's está. And that's really it for estar, some things that are temporary plus location. And the one little trick, like they explained, is if you switch ser or estar with the same word, you can really affect what you're saying. For example, if you say soy aburrido, for example, that means I am, and we said we use soy for characteristics, traits, permanent things. So what you're saying is, I'm boring. As in, I'm a boring person. With the same word, if you say estoy aburrido, what you're saying is, because that's a temporary state or condition or mood, what you're saying is, I am bored. And in English, those are two very different things, being a boring person and being bored right now. But in Spanish, it's just that simple. You switch out soy for estoy, and you change the meaning. So you can play around with that and get the meaning that you want, but you also have to be careful, because if you make the mistake, you could be calling yourself a boring person instead of saying that you're bored. Okay? That's it. Make sure to fill out your notes, turn them in, y hasta luego.